The gun was already drawn when Mamie Shepard walked through the door of the Silver Spur Saloon, and the man holding it was not pointing it at a stranger. He was pointing it at Oscar Calloway. Mamie had been in Redrock, Nevada for exactly 11 days. 11 days of dust and suspicion, and the particular loneliness that comes from being the only person in a room who does not yet know the rules. 11 days of watching Oscar Calloway from across the street, across the dinner table at the boarding house, across the vast geography of the things he refused to say. She had not come here to fall for anyone. She had come here to survive. But in the 11 days since she had arrived in this dying town, something had shifted inside her like tectonic plates, slow, foundational, impossible to reverse. And now the man who had made her want to stay was about to be killed. "You took something that belonged to me, Calloway," said the man with the gun. His name was Denton Graves, and everyone in Redrock knew that name with the particular dread usually reserved for weather and sickness. He was broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, and the hand holding the revolver did not shake. "You took it, and you hid it, and you thought I would just ride away." Oscar did not move. He stood at the bar with his hands visible flat against the worn wood surface, and his voice when he answered was so quiet it cut through the room like a blade. "You're wrong about what I took. The hell I am. Put the gun down, Denton. The hell I will." Mamie stood in the doorway frozen, and she watched Oscar Calloway in that moment, his stillness, his lack of fear, the particular dignity of a man who had been through something so dark that a gun pointed at his chest registered only as a familiar inconvenience. She had seen glimpses of that darkness in him, in the 11 days of their strange and circling acquaintance. She had wondered at it. She had been drawn to it the way people are drawn to fire in winter, knowing full well it can burn. What she had not expected, in this moment that was shaping up to be the last moment of either his life or her composure, was for him to look directly at her. Not at the gun, not at Denton Graves, at her. And she understood, in the electric and disorienting way that some truths arrive, that whatever was hidden between them, whatever had been growing in the silences and the careful distances, it was not going to survive if she stayed frozen in the doorway. She stepped inside. 11 days earlier, Mamie Shepard had arrived in Redrock, Nevada on the noon stage from Carson City, carrying a trunk that weighed more than she could comfortably lift, a letter of introduction from the Redrock School Board, and the quiet, steeled determination of a woman who has already lost the life she was supposed to have and has decided to build something else entirely. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Ohio, taught school in Missouri for 2 years, and buried her mother in the spring of 1881, which had left her the only Shepard remaining on earth, and had made the prospect of staying in Missouri, where every street corner had a memory attached like a burr feel genuinely unbearable. When the advertisement had appeared in the Missouri Gazette in June of that same year, she had read it 3 times before folding it carefully into her coat pocket. Wanted, schoolteacher for the township of Redrock, Nevada, single woman preferred, boarding accommodations provided, salary competitive with Eastern standards, apply to the Redrock Town Council, care of Harlan Briggs, mayor. The letter from Harlan Briggs, when it came, was brief and businesslike, and contained within it the information that the previous schoolteacher had left suddenly, and that the children of Redrock were presently running feral. Mamie had appreciated the honesty. She had accepted the position. She had sold what remained of her mother's house to cover the cost of the train and the stage, and she had come west with the full understanding that she was trading the familiar for something unknown. What she had not fully understood was how unknown that something would be. Redrock was a silver town that had hit its peak 5 years prior, and was now in the long, slow process of deciding whether it intended to survive. The mines were not played out, but they were not generous either, and the population that had swelled to nearly 800 at the height of the boom had thinned to something closer to 300 stubborn souls who had either too much invested to leave or too little elsewhere to go. The main street was ambitious: a hotel, a dry goods store, a saloon, a bank, a livery, a small church. But the ambition had a worn-out quality to it, like a man still wearing his Sunday suit on a Tuesday because he has nowhere better to be. The boarding house was run by a woman named Edna Marsh, who was 62 years old and had the energy of someone considerably younger and the opinions of someone considerably older. She showed Mamie to a room on the second floor with a window that faced east, and she said, "You will be the 4th schoolteacher in 3 years. I am not saying that to frighten you. I am saying it so that you understand what you are walking into." "What happened to the other 3?" Mamie had asked, setting her trunk down and testing the floorboards for squeaks. First one found a husband in Reno and followed him north. Second one couldn't stomach the isolation. Third one, Edna paused, and something shifted in her expression. "Well, the third one had reasons of her own for leaving that were none of my business, and I respected that." It was the quality of that pause that stayed with Mamie as she unpacked her things. There was a story there. Redrock felt full of stories with their backs turned, stories that were visible only in profile and would not show their faces. She ate supper her first evening at the boarding house table with Edna and 3 other boarders. A mining assier named Clement who communicated almost entirely through nods. A young woman named Pearl who worked at the dry goods store and whose cheerfulness had the slightly mechanical quality of someone who has chosen it very deliberately. And Oscar Calloway. She noticed him the way you notice a storm on the horizon, not with alarm exactly, but with the awareness that something significant is approaching, and that you have not yet decided whether to take shelter or stand in the open and let it come. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. He was 33 years old, though she would not learn his age until later. His hands were scarred in the way of working men, not brutally, but with the small cumulative evidence of a life spent doing difficult things. He wore a canvas work shirt and spoke very little at supper, and when he did speak it was measured, considered, as if words were a resource that he was careful not to waste. He was, she would learn, the foreman of the Calloway silver claim, a mine that had belonged to his father, then to him, and that he ran with 3 hired men and a stubbornness that had outlasted 2 partners and several very reasonable arguments for selling. He said hello when Edna introduced them. He passed her the bread without being asked. He was at the table for precisely 20 minutes before excusing himself with a brief apology and disappearing back through the front door into the blue Nevada evening. "Don't take it personally," Pearl said, with the cheerful tone she applied to everything. "Oscar doesn't do much socializing anymore." "Anymore," Mamie repeated, and the word sat in the air between them like a question. Pearl glanced toward the door as if checking that he had truly left. "He used to be different before his wife." "Before his wife what?" Pearl looked at Edna, who was collecting plates with the focused attention of someone who has decided not to be part of this particular conversation. "Before she died," Pearl said more quietly. 2 years ago. Fever. She was here and then she was gone, and Oscar, he changed. Everybody can see it. He's still here, still working the mine, still going through the motions. But I don't know how to say it exactly, he's somewhere else. Like he's waiting for something, but he doesn't know what." Mamie looked at the door through which Oscar had disappeared. Outside, the Nevada sky had gone from orange to deep blue, the kind of color that belongs specifically to the high desert at dusk, and somewhere in the distance a coyote was describing its loneliness to the dark. She told herself that she was not going to get involved in whatever Oscar Calloway was waiting for. She told herself that a great many times over the following week. The schoolhouse was a single room with 7 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, a wood stove that had developed an eccentric relationship with smoke, and a collection of books that had been donated at various times by various people, and had consequently no coherent educational philosophy whatsoever. Mamie spent her first full day cataloging the books, and her second day, organizing the students by age and ability, and her third day, establishing the particular kind of quiet authority that good teachers build not through volume, but through the absolute reliability of their expectations. By the fourth day she had learned all 7 names and something essential about each child, and by the 5th day the 14-year-old boy named Thomas, who had clearly decided ahead of time that he was too old for school and too smart for any teacher, had grudgingly admitted that long division was not actually beneath his dignity. The work steadied her. It always had. The specific usefulness of teaching, the daily and concrete evidence that something was being given and received, was the thing that had pulled her through the worst of her grief after her mother's death, and she was grateful for it now. But Redrock itself remained a place she had not yet inhabited. She walked through it and observed it with the careful attention she gave everything, but she was not yet part of it. She ate at Edna's table. She walked to the schoolhouse and back. She visited the dry goods store for supplies and exchanged pleasantries with Pearl. She did not visit the saloon, which in 1881 in a Nevada mining town was not unusual for a single woman. Though she was aware of it, the Silver Spur Saloon at the end of the main street, from which light and noise emerged every evening, and which represented a whole register of Redrock life that she was viewing entirely from the outside. Oscar Calloway she saw every evening at supper, and every evening she found herself paying him the kind of attention that was difficult to justify as mere observation. He came back dirty from the mine, changed before supper with the regularity of a man performing a ritual, and sat at the table with a quietness that was not unfriendly but was deeply private. He answered questions when asked. He occasionally offered information about the weather, about the state of the road south, about whether the supply wagon was expected that week. He ate everything Edna put in front of him without comment. What he did not do was volunteer anything about himself. He did not talk about the mine in terms of what he hoped for it. He did not talk about the town in terms of what it had been or what it might become. He existed in the present tense with a completeness that was almost philosophical, as if the past and the future had become places he no longer visited. On the 6th evening, Mamie asked him directly what he thought about the school. He looked up from his plate. "What about it?" "Whether it matters," she said. "Whether the town is going to be here long enough for it to matter. I am not asking out of pessimism. I am asking because the answer affects how I plan." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but the thing that comes before surprise, attention, suddenly and fully deployed. He set down his fork. "There are children here," he said. "Children need school. That's a reason for it to matter regardless of whether the town is still here in 20 years. That's a pragmatic answer. I'm a pragmatic man." "Are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. He picked up his fork again, but the shift in his expression remained, and he did not immediately look back at his plate. "The school matters," he said more quietly. "It mattered when he stopped. It has always mattered to some of us." She understood that the sentence had a ghost in it, and she did not push. But something had opened, slightly and briefly, and she had been paying enough attention to notice. The 7th day, she saw him in the street in the afternoon, unusual, as he was typically at the mine until late. He was standing outside the bank with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized instinctively, the particular look of a man who has just been told something he already knew but had been hoping was not true. She considered walking past. She almost did. Instead, she said his name. He turned, and the bleakness in his expression shifted into something more guarded. "Miss Shepard, are you all right?" "Fine, thank you." "You look," she said carefully, "like a man who has just received bad news." The silence held for a moment. Then, "Bank is calling in my note." She understood immediately what that meant in 1881 Nevada, with silver prices fluctuating and the boom years behind them. A mining operation running on borrowed capital was always walking a narrow edge. "The mine note, 30 days, he said, "to come up with the difference or forfeit a portion of the claim. Can you come up with it?" He looked at her with the slightly incredulous expression of a man who is not accustomed to being asked direct questions by women he barely knows. Then something in him seemed to decide that the directness was acceptable. "I don't know yet. Is there another investor? Someone who might? The last investor I trusted made a decision I'm still paying for," he said, and the way he said it closed the door on that subject with the finality of a bolt being thrown. She nodded and did not press. "Well," she said, "I hope it comes out right." "So do I," he said, and there was something in his voice then, not hope exactly, but the memory of what hope had felt like that made her chest ache in a way she was not prepared for. That evening at supper, she caught him watching her twice. Both times he looked away immediately, with the disciplined speed of a man who has trained himself not to want things. On the 9th day, she went to the edge of town at dusk because she could not sleep, and because the Nevada sky at that hour was genuinely extraordinary, a lavender so deep it was almost violet, with the first stars already igniting in the east, and she found him there before her. Standing at the fence that marked where the town gave way to open desert, hat in his hand again, looking out at the nothing that was also, in its particular way, everything. She almost retreated. He heard her footstep on the gravel and turned, and the retreat became impossible. "I seem to be in the habit of intruding," she said. "You're not intruding." She came and stood beside him at the fence, leaving a respectable distance between them, and they both looked out at the desert. The silence was companionable in a way that surprised her, the easy silence of people who have already said enough difficult things to each other that quiet no longer requires filling. "My wife used to come here," he said. "She did not say anything. She waited. She loved the sky out here. She was from Pennsylvania. She said the sky in Nevada was the biggest thing she'd ever seen, and she never stopped being amazed by it." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't stood here in 2 years." "Why tonight?" she asked. He turned to look at her with an expression she could not fully read, part confusion, part something more raw. "I don't entirely know," he said. They stood there until the stars were fully out, and they did not say anything else, and when she walked back to the boarding house her heartbeat was doing something unusual that she decided to attribute to the altitude. On the 10th day, she found an envelope slipped under the door of the schoolhouse. Inside was a note, written in a controlled but not elegant hand, that said simply, "The third reader you need is at the dry goods store. I've already arranged for it." O.C. She stared at the note for a full minute. She had mentioned to no one that she was missing a third reader, except to herself, while inventorying the books, and once in passing at supper, in a sentence she had not thought anyone was particularly listening to. He had been listening. She held the note for a long time, and then she tucked it into the pocket of her teaching apron, and she spent the rest of the day being particularly focused on the mathematics lesson so as not to think about it. That evening at supper she said simply, "Thank you for the reader." He said, "The children need it." She said, "Yes, still." He looked at her across the table, and the look held half a second longer than it needed to, and Pearl, across from them both, was very carefully studying her soup. On the 11th day, 3 things happened. The first was that Thomas, the 14-year-old, came to school with a split lip and the careful stillness of a boy who was not going to talk about it. Mamie dismissed the other students an hour early, claiming the stove needed tending, and sat with Thomas until he admitted that Denton Graves's foreman had hit him for supposedly stealing an apple from the supply barrel behind the saloon. She cleaned the cut with the care and efficiency of a woman who does not make a fuss and thereby communicates that the injury is taken seriously, and she told Thomas that he had done nothing wrong and that she would speak to Mayor Briggs. The second thing was that Mayor Briggs, when she found him in his office, told her in the gentle and regretful manner of a man explaining whether that Denton Graves was a complicated situation and that perhaps Thomas had been in a place he shouldn't have been. Mamie looked at the mayor for a long moment and asked him plainly whether Denton Graves was the sort of man who operated without consequence in Redrock. The mayor did not answer directly, which was itself an answer. The third thing was that she walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and found Oscar Calloway at gunpoint. She had not gone to the saloon looking for Oscar. She had gone because the saloon was where Denton Graves conducted most of his business, which she knew from Pearl, and she had gone because she was still lit with a cold, specific anger about Thomas's lip and the mayor's quiet inadequacy. She had gone because, in 11 days, she had already decided, in the deep and unreasonable way that she tended to decide things, that Redrock was worth fighting for. She had pushed through the saloon door and walked directly into the worst moment she had seen since arriving. Now, standing inside the Silver Spur with the door swinging shut behind her and Oscar Calloway's eyes locked on hers across 15 feet of tension and danger, she made a decision that her rational mind was not entirely consulted on. She walked toward Oscar, not toward Denton Graves, not toward the gun. Toward Oscar, as if the gun were not the important thing in the room, and every person watching understood from her bearing that she had made some kind of calculation and had reached a conclusion that the gun was not going to fire. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I've been looking for you." The room was so quiet she could hear the lamp oil burning. "Miss Shepard," Oscar said. His voice was careful, but she could hear something underneath it, not relief exactly, but the cautious movement of something that had been braced for impact and was now recalibrating. Denton Graves turned his cold eyes on her. He was perhaps 45, with a face that had been lived in hard and a jaw like a geological feature. "Lady," he said, "you've walked into something that is not your business." "I am the schoolteacher in Redrock," Mamie said, and she was astonished by how level her voice was. "Everything in this town is my business, including the welfare of the children whose fathers keep getting guns pointed at them." Something flickered in Denton's expression. "I don't have children." "No," she said, "but your foreman hit a 14-year-old boy today." The silence shifted in texture. She could feel the men around the room, miners, drifters, men of the town, adjusting in their seats, some of them looking at Denton with newly appraising eyes. "That is a separate matter," Denton said. "Then perhaps," Mamie said, "we can address one matter at a time. Mr. Calloway, will you come with me? I have something urgent to discuss with you outside." Oscar looked at her. Denton looked at Oscar. Oscar looked at Denton. And then, with the particular choice of a man who has weighed his options in the span of a breath and has decided on the one that does not involve bloodshed today, Oscar straightened from the bar and said, "All right, Miss Shepard." Denton did not lower the gun immediately. But there was something he was calculating too, and whatever it was, it resolved in the direction of patience. "This conversation," he said to Oscar, "is not finished." "No," Oscar said, "but it can wait." They walked out of the Silver Spur together, and the door swung shut behind them, and Mamie stood on the boardwalk in the Nevada evening and breathed. Oscar turned to look at her. "That was," he said, "one of the more extraordinary things I have witnessed." "I was terrified," she said frankly. "You didn't look it." "I was not about to let it show." She pressed her hands together to stop them from trembling. "What does he want from you?" Oscar was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street toward the fading light in the west. "It's complicated." "It always is," she said. "I've been here 11 days, and I can already see that everything in Redrock is complicated." "What specifically does Denton Graves believe you took from him?" He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the most open she had yet seen it, the guarded layers pulled back by the sheer velocity of what had just happened. "Evidence," he said. "I found something in the mine 6 weeks ago. Something that implicates Denton Graves in the death of a man he claimed died in an accident." The words landed in the evening air with their full weight. "Evidence of murder," she said. "Evidence of something. I don't know yet exactly what." He ran a hand through his hair, the first unguarded physical gesture she had seen from him. 3 years ago, my former business partner died in the mine. Denton Graves owned the claim adjacent to mine. There was a dispute over where the vein ran. My partner said he could prove the vein crossed into our claim and that Graves had been mining it illegally. He died before he could prove it. Everybody called it an accident. And you didn't. I never could prove otherwise. until 6 weeks ago when I found documents, survey documents, that had been hidden deep in an old shaft. Documents that show Graves bribed the original surveyor to alter the boundary records. So he's been stealing silver from your claim for years, Mamie said, and my partner died before he could expose it. He paused. I sent copies of the documents to the county sheriff in Carson City. I'm waiting for a response. Graves knows I found something. He doesn't know what specifically because his foreman has been watching my mine ever since. The bank note, Mamie said suddenly. Is Graves behind the bank calling it in? He looked at her with an expression that said the thought had already occurred to him, and that he was grimly impressed it had occurred to her too. Raymond Fitch at the bank has done business with Graves for years. It's possible. It's more than possible, she said. He's trying to squeeze you out before the sheriff's response arrives. Yes. They stood there in the blue evening, and the weight of it settled around them, the hidden motive, the dark past, the trap that was being constructed around Oscar Calloway with patient, deliberate care. And she felt something she had not expected to feel, something beyond the anger she had come to the saloon with and the fear she had walked in with. She felt the specific outrage of someone who has arrived in a place and decided it belongs to her and found it being corrupted from within. "What can I do?" she said. He looked at her for a long, still moment. "You've already done more than you needed to. That's not what I asked." Something moved across his face, the ghost of something that was almost a smile, though it didn't quite arrive. "You are a very unusual woman, Miss Shepard." "I'm a schoolteacher from Ohio," she said. "I'm not unusual. I simply pay attention and am not afraid to act on what I observe." This time the ghost did arrive, brief, cautious, like a light seen through a closing door, and it transformed his face so entirely that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. "All right," he said. "I'm going to write to the sheriff again tomorrow, and I'm going to speak to Clement the Assyr. He knows the original survey records. He may be able to corroborate what I've found. And the bank note, 30 days, I'll find a way to address it." His jaw set. "I'm not leaving this claim. It was my father's before mine. It is not Graves's to take." She understood, hearing him say it, that the claim was more than silver to him. It was the last thing he had that had not been taken by grief or time or other people's corruption. "Good," she said. "I'll help where I can." He turned to look at her again, and this time the look held long enough to be something other than casual. "Why?" He said, "You've been here 11 days. You don't owe this town anything." She thought about the question seriously, because it was a serious question, and he had asked it with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Because Thomas came to school today with a split lip," she said finally, "and the mayor told me it was a complicated situation. I am not interested in places where a child getting hit by a grown man is considered complicated." She paused. "And because I think this place could be worth something if people are willing to fight for it." He looked at her for a long time after that. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "You remind me that this place is worth staying for." He paused, and the pause was its own kind of revelation. I had not said that in years. The words fell into the evening with a weight that was both quiet and enormous, and she understood that they were not entirely about the town, and he understood that she understood, and they both stood very still in the amber aftermath of that admission, neither of them certain what it meant and both of them already knowing exactly what it meant. "Well," she said finally, because she had to say something and there was nothing adequate. "Good." He looked at the ground briefly, then back up at her. "I should go back and speak with Clement," she said. "Yes, tomorrow. Tonight you should eat something. Edna made a roast." He followed her back to the boarding house, and they ate Edna's roast in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, warmer, more conscious, as if something had been planted between them that would now need tending. 3 days later, the letter arrived from the county sheriff in Carson City. Oscar brought it to her, which itself said something, the fact that he wanted to tell her first, before anyone else, and she read it with him in the yard behind the boarding house while the morning light sliced across the desert in long gold bars. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Patterson, was coming to Redrock. He would arrive within the week. He intended to examine the documents personally and interview relevant parties. He made no promises, but the language of the letter was careful and purposeful, and Mamie, who had grown up around her father's legal correspondence, recognized the quality of its intent. "It's going to be all right," she said. "It might be," Oscar said. "It is," she said, and the certainty in her voice came from somewhere she could not fully account for. "The documents are real. The records will corroborate. Clement has already confirmed the discrepancy. Yes, yes, then it is going to be all right." She handed the letter back to him and looked up at him in the morning light, and the light did something to his face that made the careful severity of it visible as the beautiful thing it actually was. "You've been holding this alone for 6 weeks. I didn't have anyone to." He stopped. "No," she agreed quietly, "but now you do." The words had not been planned, and they landed with more weight than she had intended, and his eyes met hers in the morning light with an intensity that made her suddenly very occupied with folding her hands together and looking at a point slightly to the left of his face. "Miss Shepard," he said. "Mamie," she said. "You can call me Mamie. We've been in enough situations together by now." "Mamie," he said, and his voice made her name into something she had not heard in it before. "I want to say something, and I need you to know that I mean it plainly and without any intention to overstep." "All right. I am glad you came to Redrock." She looked at him. The sincerity in his expression was so unguarded, so openly delivered, that it was almost uncomfortable to receive, the way brilliant light after a long darkness requires adjustment. "I am glad, too," she said carefully, "more than I expected to be." He nodded, and he looked down at the letter in his hand, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is holding something he is not certain what to do with. Then he said, "Would you like to see the mine?" She stared at him. "You want to take me to the mine?" "I want to show you what I'm fighting for," he said. "If you're going to help me fight for it, you should see it." She said yes. They went on a Saturday afternoon when the workers were off. Oscar drove a small wagon, and she sat beside him on the bench. And the road to the mine wound up into the hills behind Redrock through scrub and sage, and the occasional dramatic outcropping of the red rock that had given the town its name. The air was thinner and sharper and smelled of mineral earth, and she found herself leaning slightly forward the way she always did when approaching something new that interested her. The mine entrance was modest. A timber-framed shaft mouth set into the hillside with rails running out of it for the ore cars, a small operation house off to the side, a machinery shed beyond that. But what was not modest was the view from the flat ground in front of the shaft, which encompassed the entire sweep of the valley below. Redrock laid out in miniature, the silver thread of the dry creek bed, the dark brush of the hills to the north, and beyond everything the immense Nevada sky. "My father built this," Oscar said. He was standing at the edge of the flat ground looking out over the valley. "He came west in 1858. He was a farmer's son from Kentucky who had never seen a mountain and couldn't stop walking toward them once he started. He found this vein in 1864, built the shaft himself with 2 other men who were his partners until they weren't." He paused. "He left me this claim when he died. It was the only thing he had to leave." "He sounds like someone worth honoring," Mamie said. Oscar looked at her. He was a difficult man, stubborn and private and not easy to love. But he was honest, and he worked harder than any man I've ever known, and he believed that this," he gestured at the shaft, the valley, the sky, "was worth something. Not just the silver, the whole thing, the life out here, the space." "Is that why you stayed?" she asked. "After your wife, after your partner, you could have sold and gone somewhere easier." He was quiet for a long time. A hawk wheeled overhead in the bright air, riding a thermal in a slow, patient spiral. "My wife asked me near the end not to leave," he said. "Not specifically, she didn't frame it that way, but she loved this place too. She came here hating it and ended up loving it in the way of converts, which is often the deepest kind." His voice was careful and controlled in the way of a man who has said these particular words only inside his own head before. Leaving would have felt like leaving her, as well. Mamie was quiet. She understood grief well enough not to try to improve upon it with language. "I stayed," he said, "but I stopped engaging with it. I did the work and I managed the mine and I ate supper and I slept and I got up and started again. But I was not," he paused again. "I was not here really, not in the way that counts." "And now?" she asked. He turned to look at her fully, and the afternoon sun was behind her and made a kind of brightness around her that was not magical but was simply the physics of afternoon light, and he looked at her in it with something shifting openly in his face. "And now," he said, "I find myself present again, more than I have been in 2 years." She held his gaze. "I'm glad," she said. "You shouldn't waste your life watching it from somewhere else." "No," he agreed. "I shouldn't." They stood there in the high, clean air above Redrock, and the hawk completed its spiral and dove and rose again, and the town below went about its Saturday afternoon business in perfect miniature, and something between Mamie Shepard and Oscar Calloway shifted from potential to actual, not yet said in any language they could speak aloud, but real in the way that earthquakes are real before they surface, felt in the deep places before the ground moves. He drove her back to town before sunset. At the boarding house gate, he stopped the wagon and offered his hand to help her down, and when her hand was in his, she was very aware of the warmth and the steadiness of it. He held it a half-second beyond necessity and then released it, and she went inside. And at supper that night Pearl watched the two of them with the expression of a woman who is keeping a very happy secret that is not yet technically hers to keep. Sheriff Aldous Patterson arrived 5 days later on the noon stage, accompanied by a deputy and a land records official from Carson City who carried a leather briefcase with the focused attention of a man who knows what he has been sent to do. Mamie was at the schoolhouse when the stage came in, and she heard about it from Thomas, who had been eating his noon meal on the front step and had watched the whole arrival with the sharp attention of a 14-year-old who has already decided that the affairs of adults are interesting. He came to her desk with his eyes bright and said, "The sheriff's here, Miss Shepard." "Good," she said. "Is it going to be about Mr. Calloway's mine?" She looked at him. He was a perceptive boy, Thomas, in the way of children who have learned to read a room by necessity. "It is about making sure that the right things are recorded correctly," she said. "Which is what the law is for when it's working properly." Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone filing it away for future reference. "Do you think it'll work?" "I think the truth is hard to permanently suppress," she said. "It finds its way out eventually. The question is whether it finds it in time to matter." "You sound like a preacher," Thomas said. "I've been in enough places where the truth came too late," she said, thinking of her mother, thinking of things she had seen in Missouri that she did not speak about. "I prefer the version where it arrives on schedule." The sheriff spent the afternoon with Oscar and Clement and the land records official. Mamie was not present for those conversations because she had no standing to be, but at supper that evening Oscar was different, not lighter exactly, but less compressed, as if some structural burden had been redistributed. He reported in his brief and careful way that the sheriff had examined the documents and had confirmed with the records official that the survey alterations were evident. There would be an investigation. There would be a formal hearing in Carson City within the month. "And Denton Graves?" Mamie asked. "He was spoken to this afternoon," Oscar said. "He's not under arrest, not yet, but he's been formally notified of the investigation and told not to leave the territory." "Is he angry?" "He is very quiet," Oscar said, which, the way he said it, was more concerning than angry would have been. 2 days after the sheriff's arrival, Denton Graves came to the schoolhouse. Mamie was alone, the students had been dismissed for the day, and she was at the board erasing the arithmetic lesson when she heard the door open. She turned and found him in the doorway, filling it with his considerable breadth, hat in hand in a manner that was formal without being respectful. "Miss Shepard," he said. "Mr. Graves," she said. She did not move from where she was standing, though everything in her wanted to step backward. She had learned in Ohio and Missouri, and in the Silver Spur saloon, that the worst thing you can do in front of a man who wants you to be afraid is show it. "I understand you've taken a particular interest in Oscar Calloway's affairs," he said. I take an interest in the affairs of this community, she said. Mr. Calloway is a member of this community. He's a man who has made accusations that he cannot prove, Graves said. He sent documents to the county sheriff, she said. The documents appear to be self-proving. Graves looked at her with the flat, assessing gaze of a man recategorizing a threat. You're young to be so far from home, he said. I'm exactly where I intend to be, she said. Redrock is a complicated place, he said, using the same word the mayor had used, and she recognized with clarity that it meant the same thing in both men's mouths, that there were arrangements in place and that she was disturbing them. I've heard that before, she said. I find the complications less troubling than the simplicities. A man who bribes surveyors and profits from a colleague's death is simple. A community that tolerates it is simple. The complicated part is fixing it. I prefer the complicated part. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he set his hat back on his head, deliberately. You should think carefully, he said, about how long you intend to stay in Redrock. I intend to stay as long as there are children here who need teaching, she said, and I don't intend to let that calculation be influenced by any factor you introduce. He left. She sat down in the nearest student's chair immediately because her legs had decided to communicate their opinion of the encounter, and their opinion was that it had been more frightening than she had permitted herself to feel during it. Oscar was at the boarding house gate when she arrived home. He had been waiting. She could see from his bearing that he had been there for some time and that Pearl or Edna had told him about Graves's visit. His jaw was set with a tightness that was not anger but its more controlled and dangerous cousin. I heard he came to the school, he said. He did. What did he say? He suggested I think carefully about how long I intend to stay, she said. I told him I intend to stay indefinitely. Something moved through Oscar's expression that was complex and layered: concern, pride, relief, and something else that was harder to name. Mamie, he said, and then he stopped, because there was too much in whatever he had intended to say next. I'm all right, she said. He didn't threaten me directly. He was exploratory, seeing if I could be persuaded. Can you be persuaded? He said it with a seriousness that indicated he needed to know the actual answer. No, she said simply, not by him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, come and walk with me. They went to the edge of town, to the fence where they had stood before, and the evening was beginning its magnificent work on the Nevada sky, and the coyotes were starting up their distant testimony. They stood at the fence, and after a silence he turned to her. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. When my wife died, he said, I made a decision, not a conscious one, not one I sat down and made deliberately, but a decision all the same. I decided that the mine was what remained, the work, the claim my father left. I would work and I would maintain and I would endure and I would not, he paused. I would not need anything else. I would not let myself need anything else because needing things is how you get hurt when they're taken. She waited. I have been successfully adhering to that decision, he said, for 2 years, until about 11 days ago. The night air was cool and smelled of sage and distance, and she held still the way she did in the classroom when something important was happening and she did not want to interrupt it. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I want to be honest with you because you have been nothing but honest with me, and you deserve that in return. You came into this town, and in the space of 11 days you have redistributed something, in me, something I had put away. She thought carefully about what to say. She thought about grief, and about the way it calculates, always measuring what was against what is, always running that comparison. And she thought about her own losses, and the way she had chosen to respond to them. She thought about the 9 days of watching Oscar Calloway across supper tables and evening horizons, and the 10th day when she had found a note about a reader tucked under the schoolhouse door. I am not asking you to put anything away or take anything out, she said finally. I am not making a claim on you, Oscar. I want to be equally clear about that. I came to Redrock to teach and to build something here and to find out whether this is a place that will hold me. I did not come looking for this. This, he repeated, and the word in his voice was not quite a question. "Whatever this is," she said, "whatever is happening, I am aware of it. I want you to know I am aware of it, and I am not running from it, but I am also not—" She stopped. "I am also not going to pretend it is not here." He looked at her with the full attention of a man who is no longer maintaining any guard, and it was the most exposed she had ever seen him. "It is very much here," he said. "Yes," she said. They looked at each other in the last light of the Nevada evening, and the stars began their quiet detonation overhead, and everything was understood between them without being spoken in a way that was either terrifying or wonderful and was probably both simultaneously. He took her hand. It was a simple thing, his hand, finding hers on the fence rail, and it was not impetuous or declaratory but simply present, and she did not move away. She turned her hand over and let his close around it, and they stood there in the enormous dark until it was late enough that Edna would worry. In the weeks that followed, the hearing in Carson City was scheduled, and Oscar prepared his documents with the assistance of Mamie and Clement, and the county records official certified the alterations in the original survey, and the town of Redrock operated with the particular suspended quality of a community waiting to see how something large and consequential is going to resolve. Denton Graves did not leave. He was present in the town with an ominous quietude that everyone could feel. He no longer came to the school. He no longer approached Mamie directly. But his foreman watched Oscar's mind from across the ridge, and Oscar was aware of being watched, and Mamie was aware of Oscar being aware of it, and the whole thing sat over the town like weather that has not yet broken. Between Mamie and Oscar, things developed with a slowness that was deliberate and felt right, the slowness of people who have both been hurt by impermanence and who are therefore constitutionally careful with things they value. He walked her to the schoolhouse in the mornings when he was not needed early at the mine. She brought supper to him at the mine on 2 occasions when she knew he was working late and wouldn't make it back to Edna's table. She sat with him in the evenings and they talked about Ohio and about Kentucky, and about the particular comedy of being far from the places that made you, and about books, which she read extensively, and he read less than he wished, and she immediately corrected by lending him things from the school library with notes in the margins about which passages she thought would interest him. He wrote notes back in the margins in his careful handwriting, and she found herself going to those notes first when she picked the books up again. And the conversation they were having in the margins of other people's stories was the truest conversation she had ever had with anyone. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in October, 6 weeks after her arrival in Redrock. They were in the yard behind the boarding house, where there was a bench that caught the last of the afternoon sun, and they had been sitting there reading together. She with a novel, he with the territorial survey maps she had helped him organize for the hearing. And when she looked up to say something about the passage she had just read, she found him already looking at her. She did not finish the sentence about the passage. He leaned and kissed her with the deliberate care of a man who is entirely certain this is what he wants to do and is not going to do it carelessly. It lasted exactly long enough to be conclusive, and then he pulled back and looked at her with an expression that said he was ready to apologize if necessary and hoping very much that it wasn't. "Well," she said, because she had used that word before in moments where nothing else was adequate. "Well," he agreed. "Good," she said. He smiled fully, for the first time she had seen, without anything holding it back, and it reorganized his entire face into something so unguarded and warm that she felt the warmth of it physically, like standing near a fire on a cold night. She thought, there he is. The man underneath all that careful grief. There he is. She kissed him back, which she thought made her meaning clear enough. The hearing in Carson City was scheduled for the 2nd week of November. Oscar would need to travel 4 days there and back on the stage, and the prospect of his absence for 8 days filled Mamie with a feeling she identified accurately as the early architecture of love, which always makes itself most visible in the dread of a person's leaving. The night before he was to depart, They sat together on the bench in the yard, and the air was cold enough now to require her good wool coat, and he had a blanket from the house that he had draped over both of them without ceremony, and she leaned against his shoulder because the cold made it entirely reasonable, and because she wanted to, and because she had stopped maintaining elaborate reasons for the things she did around him. "I'll be back by the 20th, he said. "I know," she said. "The school will be fine. I have been running a classroom for 2 years without anyone to worry on my behalf, and I will manage 8 days. "I know you will," he said. "That's not why." He stopped. She looked up at him. "What?" "I find that I don't want to leave you," he said, with the slightly surprised quality of a man who is still getting used to the fact that he has something he doesn't want to leave. That is a new experience after 2 years of not particularly wanting to stay anywhere. She took his hand under the blanket. 8 days, she said. "I will write you every day. I will write back from every stop." "Good," she said. "Then we'll have something to read." He kissed the top of her head, which was the most domestic and unbounded gesture he had yet made, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through the wool coat and deep into the part of her that had been cold for the 2 years since her mother died. He left the next morning on the 6 o'clock stage, and she watched it from the main street with her hands folded and her chin up, and she went to the schoolhouse and taught mathematics and history and reading to 7 children with full attention, and only partially thought about where he was every hour of the day. He wrote from every stop. The letters were not long. Oscar Calloway was not a man of excess, but they were dense, each word selected, and they said more in their brevity than most men managed in paragraphs. He wrote about the landscape between Redrock and Carson City, about a conversation with a prospector on the stage who had made him laugh, about a passage in the book she had sent with him that he had read twice on the road. He wrote in the last letter before the hearing, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that coming back to Redrock afterward is the clearest intention I currently have. I'm telling you this so that the intention is said and on record, as befits a formal proceeding." She read that letter 3 times and then put it in the drawer beside the other ones. The hearing lasted 2 days. The county records official testified to the alterations in the survey documents. Clement testified to the discrepancies he had found between the original survey marks and the boundary stones. The documents Oscar had recovered from the mine shaft were entered into evidence and evaluated by 2 independent surveyors whom the court had appointed. Denton Graves was represented by a lawyer from Reno who was very good and whose skill served primarily to establish how much pressure the evidence was able to withstand, which turned out to be very little. The court found that the survey records had been fraudulently altered and that the Calloway claim boundary was exactly where Oscar had said it was, extending 140 yards past where Graves had been mining. The court further ordered an investigation into the death of Oscar's former business partner, the man who had tried to prove this 3 years before. That investigation would take months and might never reach a formal criminal conclusion, but the finding of fraud was immediate and binding, and Denton Graves was ordered to repay the value of all silver extracted from the falsely claimed area, a figure that, when the assay records were calculated, was substantial enough to effectively ruin him. Oscar came back to Redrock on the 19th of November, a day earlier than expected, because the hearing had concluded faster than anticipated, and he had not wanted to spend an extra night in Carson City when Redrock was 6 hours away. Mamie was at the schoolhouse when she heard the stage. She did not run, because she was the schoolteacher and she had 5 students watching her, but she set the reading lesson with a speed and decisiveness that Thomas later described as alarming, and she walked to the main street with the posture of a woman who is not hurrying even though she is covering ground very quickly. He was climbing down from the stage when she came around the corner of the dry goods store, and he saw her immediately across the width of the main street, and the expression that came onto his face was not dramatic. It was quiet, the particular quiet of something settling into place that has been loose, and she walked to him, and he met her halfway across the street, and they stopped 2 feet apart and looked at each other. "You're back early," she said. "The hearing was efficient," he said. "How did it go?" "We won," he said. She let out a long breath she had not known she was holding. "Good," she said. "Graves has to repay the extraction value," he said. "It'll break him." "The bank note," he paused, and something almost like wonder crossed his face. "The bank will be releasing the note. With the repayment from Graves, I have more than enough to clear it. So you keep the mine. I keep the mine." They stood in the main street of Redrock, while the stage horses were being changed, and a cold November wind came down off the hills and lifted the dust of the street in small spirals, and she thought, "This is a man who has been holding something terrible alone for years and has just watched it resolve. And the thing that I most want to do is put my arms around him right here in the street. And in 1880, Nevada in the middle of the day on the main street, that is not something I am going to do without a very good reason." She held out her hand instead, and he took it, and then he pulled her in, gently and without asking, and she let herself be pulled, and they stood there for a moment on the main street of Redrock with his arms around her and his chin resting briefly on the top of her head, and Pearl was watching from the door of the dry goods store with an expression of unalloyed delight. Denton Graves left Redrock in December. He went quietly, which was not the way anyone had expected him to go, but the quiet made a particular sense when you understood that the alternative was a full criminal investigation into his partner's death, and that the evidence was growing less favorable to him with each thing the investigator turned over. He sold what he could, settled what he was ordered to, and was gone before the new year. The investigation into the partner's death was eventually closed with a finding of inconclusive evidence, which was not justice exactly, but was as close as the machinery of 1881 Nevada could come to it. Oscar held the finding in his hands for a long time when he received it, and then folded it carefully and put it away, and Mamie sat with him in the quiet that followed and did not try to improve it with words. Christmas in Redrock in 1880 was modest and cold and oddly beautiful. Edna decorated the boarding house with evergreen boughs that Oscar and one of the mine workers had brought down from the higher hills, and Pearl organized a small community gathering at the church hall that was attended by nearly everyone who remained in town, and Mamie's students performed a reading from the school that Thomas led with the grave dignity of a boy who has decided that reading aloud is actually a skill worth possessing. After the gathering, Oscar and Mamie walked home through the cold, clear night, and the stars over Nevada were so dense and bright that they cast a kind of light, and their breath came out in small white clouds in the frozen air, and he took her hand when they were away from the lights of the church hall and did not let it go. He stopped on the main street in front of the boarding house under the cold stars. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" He turned to face her. In the starlight, his expression had the openness she had grown accustomed to seeing now, the unguarded quality that the first weeks of knowing him had revealed only in pieces, and that was now, more often than not, just his face, simply his face, with all the care and gravity and occasional almost smile of it. "About what comes next," he said. "For the mine, for the town, for—" he paused. "I've been thinking about asking you something, and I've been waiting until the circumstances were settled enough. Until Graves was resolved. Until I had something to stand on that wasn't borrowed or contested." She waited, and the cold was not cold, and the stars were extremely present. "I know you came to Redrock for the teaching position," he said. "I know this was not where you intended to be forever. I know you've been weighing whether it's the right place. And I know I cannot ask you to make a decision about that based on—" he stopped. "I don't want to pressure your decision about whether to stay, but I find that I cannot keep not saying this, which is that I want you to stay, not just as the school teacher," as he took a breath. "As mine, as my Oscar," she said. "I'm not saying it well." "You're saying it fine," she said. "Ask the question." He looked at her with the straightforwardness of the man he was. "Will you marry me, Mamie Shepard?" The stars were extremely bright. Somewhere in the distance a dog was philosophizing at the moon. The cold pressed in on all sides with the intimacy of winter in the high desert. "Yes," she said. "Of course I will." Something happened to his face then that she did not have words for. It was not just the smile, though the smile was there, the full unguarded one she had first seen in the yard when she kissed him back. It was something deeper than that, the look of a man who has been afraid for a very long time and has just been told that the fear was unnecessary, that the thing he feared losing was not going to be taken, that he was allowed to have this. He kissed her in the middle of the main street of Redrock, under the Nevada winter stars, and Pearl, who was walking back from the church hall with Edna and happened to round the corner of the general store at precisely that moment, said later that it was the best Christmas present Redrock had ever given her. They married in February of 1882 in the church on the north end of Redrock's main street, with Edna and Pearl and Thomas, and all 6 of the other students and Clement, and every remaining soul in Redrock who cared to attend, which turned out to be most of them. The minister was a spare, sincere man named Faber, who had come to Redrock 3 years ago with the boom, and had stayed with the stubbornness that characterized so many of the town's survivors. Mamie wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had altered at the collar and cuffs with some ivory lace that Pearl had ordered special from the dry goods catalog, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that one of her youngest students, a 6-year-old girl named Rosie, had pressed and wrapped in ribbon over the preceding month with the focused devotion of someone who has been waiting her whole 6 years to contribute to something important. Oscar stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that was new, that he had ridden to Carson City to have made, because he said the occasion warranted something new. And when Mamie walked up the aisle, he looked at her with an expression that made Edna quietly find her handkerchief and Pearl forget temporarily to breathe. They said their vows with the clarity and conviction of people who have thought very carefully about what words mean. When Minister Faber pronounced them married, Oscar kissed her with the same decisive care as always, and the small congregation of Redrock made considerably more noise than its size suggested it was capable of. And Thomas, in the back row, did not cry but sat with the particular stillness of a 14-year-old boy who is deeply moved and intends to take that intelligence to his grave. That spring, Mamie continued teaching, because the school needed her, and because teaching was not something she had any intention of giving up. Oscar did not ask her to. He understood, as some men in 1881 did and many did not, that the school was not merely an occupation but something she carried the way he carried the mine, as identity, as purpose, as the specific form that her contribution to the world took. They talked about it directly, early in their engagement, and he had said simply that he would not ask her to diminish herself on his account, and she had said she would not expect him to either, and they had shaken hands on it with the slightly comic formality of people who are very serious about something, and are also aware of being slightly absurd. In the summer of 1882, Redrock had something happen that it had not had in 2 years. New people arrived. A family from Utah, the Calloways, who had heard that the legal situation with the Calloway claim had stabilized the town's prospects. A young couple from San Francisco who were opening a hardware business to serve the region. A widow named Agnes who wanted to open a millinery shop and who within 3 weeks had become Edna's closest friend and most contentious card partner. The population of Redrock crept upward toward 400. The school expanded to 9 students and then 12, and Mamie wrote to the town council requesting a second room and a second teacher, and made the case with the organized precision of someone who knows exactly how to build an argument and is not interested in hearing no. She got the room by September. Oscar's mine produced steadily, not the spectacular numbers of the peak boom but solid, sustainable yields that, combined with the settlement from Graves's repayment, had put the claim on sound financial ground for the first time in years. He hired a fourth worker, then a fifth. He made one small improvement to the shaft mechanics each month, working through a systematic list he had been maintaining in his head for 2 years and now had the means to execute. In the evenings, they sat together in the house they had moved into, a small frame house on the eastern edge of town that Oscar had owned for 3 years but had barely furnished, and that Mamie transformed over the course of several months from a space that said nothing about anyone into a place that said a great deal about both of them. Books on every available surface, a good wool rug from a Paiute woman at the trading post, a rocker that Oscar had found at a yard sale in Carson City and had cleaned and repaired himself because the mechanism of its making interested him. Curtains that were a dark gold, nearly amber, that she had chosen because they made the light inside the house feel like October. They read in the evenings, side by side. They talked about things large and small. He was learning that she had opinions about everything, and that those opinions were almost always interesting even when he disagreed, which he sometimes said so, and those disagreements were the most enjoyable conversations he had ever had. She was learning that he processed things slowly and completely, that when he said something he meant it exactly, and that the economy of his words was not withholding but precision, and she had come to value it the way you value any tool that is built for exactly what it's asked to do. In the winter of 1882, Mamie discovered she was expecting. She told Oscar on a December evening in the kitchen, while he was doing something to the wood stove that required tools and attention, and he went very still when she said it. Then he set down the tool very carefully, which was the action of a man who needs his hands to be occupied with nothing so that they can do what he is about to ask them to do, which was to take her face in them gently and look at her. "Are you?" he started. "I am very well," she said. "I feel well. I am not afraid." He stopped. "I don't have words for this." "That's all right," she said. "I have plenty. We can share." He kissed her, and she could feel through the kiss that he was doing that thing he did when something was too large to process, receiving it in pieces, carefully, the way he received everything important. She put her hands over his and held his face against hers for a moment. "You're going to be a wonderful father," she said. He pulled back and looked at her with the full intensity of his gray-green eyes. "You think so?" "I have never been more certain of anything," she said. "You are patient and honest, and you show up, Oscar. Those are the 3 things that matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father was all 3 of those things and still managed to be difficult." "Then you'll be a wonderful father who is occasionally difficult," she said, "which is probably realistic." He laughed, actually laughed, the full sound of it, which she was still occasionally startled by when it came because it was so completely unguarded. "I suppose that is realistic." In August of 1883, their son was born. They named him James after Oscar's father, which was Oscar's suggestion, and which Mamie accepted with the private understanding that naming him James was a form of making peace with a complicated inheritance. James Calloway arrived with considerable conviction and immediately began demonstrating what his parents would recognize as the fundamental architecture of his personality: stubborn, curious, deeply interested in everything in his immediate environment, and constitutionally opposed to doing anything on someone else's schedule. He was, in short, both of them in equal measure. Edna held him within the first hour and declared him perfect, and then amended that to say he was spirited, which was Edna's word for what others might call loudly expressed. Pearl was the next one through the door and sat with Mamie for 2 hours and did not say much but was entirely present, which was its own form of friendship. Thomas, who was 16 now and fully as tall as Oscar, came by in the evening with an awkward formality that broke into genuine warmth when James, newly quiet and studying the room with the dark eyes of the newly arrived, looked directly at him. "He's looking at me," Thomas said, with a reverence that suggested this was possibly the most significant thing that had ever happened. "Babies do that," Mamie said. "It feels very specific," Thomas said, and held out one finger, which James promptly wrapped his hand around with the complete commitment of someone establishing a claim. The town of Redrock grew around the Calloways, and the Calloways grew within the town, each element part of the other, each making the other more possible. Mamie hired a second teacher in 1884, a young woman named Grace who had come from Arizona and who was afraid of nothing and excellent at science. And the two of them between them built a school that was, by any honest accounting, better than what most Nevada mining towns had to offer. Oscar's mine continued its steady yield, and he took on a partnership with one of the new arrivals, a methodical man named Harker who had mining engineering training from back east and who brought a technical knowledge that complemented Oscar's practical experience. They were, both of them, in the place where they had meant to be. Not the place they had started, not the place they had imagined, but the place they had arrived at through grief and stubbornness, and the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic but is simply the refusal to leave. On a September evening in 1885, 3 years and several lifetimes after the first time they had stood at the fence at the edge of town, Mamie and Oscar went back there. James was 2 years old and asleep at Edna's, who had appointed herself his honorary grandmother with the decisiveness she applied to all important decisions. The evening was warm, the sky was doing its extraordinary work, and they stood at the fence in the same configuration as the first time, looking out at the desert. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. It was not an anxious question. It was the question of a man who is secure enough in the answer to be curious about it. She thought about it genuinely, which he would expect of her. "No," she said. "I think sometimes about where I came from, Ohio, my mother's house, but not about leaving here." She paused. "Do you?" "Not since you came," he said. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, the way she had learned to do in 2.5 years of being beside him in the various configurations of their life. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they looked out at the desert and the enormous sky. "You said something to me once," she said, "about 2 weeks after I arrived. You said that I reminded you that this place was worth staying for, that you hadn't said that in years." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember. I've thought about that a lot," she said, "about what it meant, to you and to me." Hearing it, she paused. "I think it was the moment I understood what was happening between us. Not the first time you kissed me, not the first time you took my hand. That sentence, on the street in the evening." He turned to look at her, the evening light gentle on the lines of his face that she had memorized without meaning to over the course of 2 years, the small scar above his left brow from a long-ago mining incident, the particular way the gray at his temples had deepened slightly since James was born, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he was in the sun, and had become a permanent record of all the Nevada days he had spent squinting at the horizon. "What about it?" he said. "I just wanted you to know that I understood it," she said, "that I knew what it cost you to say, and that I was glad you said it." She paused. "I was glad I was the reason." He pulled her closer, and she felt his arm tighten around her with the quiet intensity of something deeply meant. "You are still the reason," he said, "every day." "Good," she said. "I intend to keep being the reason." He kissed her temple, and the desert spread out before them in the amber September light, enormous and patient and entirely itself. And Redrock was at their backs with its small sound of life. A dog, a voice from somewhere, the faint ring of metal on metal from the direction of the livery, and the future was out there in the distance like the stars that were beginning to appear, not yet fully visible but real, already on their way. By 1887, Redrock had grown to 600 residents. The silver was not giving out. The Calloway claim had expanded carefully, with 2 additional shafts that Oscar and Harker had identified over the previous 3 years. There was talk of a proper telegraph line reaching the town, and a territorial representative had come twice to discuss the road to Carson City being improved for regular freight wagons. The school had 21 students. Mamie was considering requesting a 3rd teacher. James was 4 and deeply interested in the mechanisms of the water pump in the backyard. He spent entire mornings in contemplative relationship with the pump handle, evaluating its operation, and Oscar would sometimes come around the corner of the house and find him standing there regarding the pump with the seriousness of an engineer. And the expression on Oscar's face at these moments was something Mamie only occasionally caught because he did not know she was watching, and it was the purest expression she had ever seen on a human face. In the spring of 1887, Mamie told Oscar that James was going to have a sibling. This time he did not go still. He caught her by the waist and lifted her briefly, which he had never done before and which surprised them both. And she laughed, really laughed, and he set her down and they stood in the kitchen with her laughing and his face doing something that went entirely beyond the capacity of his usual economy with expression. Their daughter, Clara, was born in October of 1887. She arrived in the world with the specific efficient competence of someone who has assessed the situation and decided she doesn't need any extra time for it. She was, from her first hour, the most quietly determined person Mamie had ever encountered, including Mamie herself. James regarded Clara for approximately 20 minutes after she was first placed near him, and then announced that she was all right, which Oscar repeated to everyone who came to visit because he found it the funniest and most perfectly James thing that James had ever said. Thomas, who was 20 years old now and working at the mine under Oscar's supervision with the focused dedication of a young man who has found the thing he's good at, came by with flowers, real ones, from the window boxes of the new florist who had opened on the main street, and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at Clara with the same reverence he had shown James at the fence, as if very small people consistently knocked him into a kind of awe. In 1888, there was a new mayor in Redrock. The old mayor, Harlan Briggs, had retired in 1886, and the new one was a man named Garrett Cole who had come from Sacramento with the particular combination of practical intelligence and civic idealism that makes for a useful public official. Cole was not complicated, in the way that Graves had been complicated. He was simply a man who was trying to build something, and who was willing to make the investments that building required. He came to Oscar in the spring of 1888 with a proposal. The town needed someone who understood the mining operations, who could speak knowledgeably about the claim boundaries and the extraction rates and the long-term prospects of the silver, to serve in an advisory capacity to the town council. He was asking Oscar to take the role. Oscar sat with the proposal for 2 evenings. He came to Mamie on the 3rd evening and said, "What do you think?" "I think you have spent 6 years fighting for this town," she said, "and this is the town asking you to help it formalize that. It would take time from the mine. Harker can manage the mine when you're not there. You know he can." She paused. "I think you should do it." He accepted the role. In 1889, Nevada was preparing for formal statehood processes, still a territory in the legal technicalities of its situation, with the larger politics of Washington moving at their own speed. But the territory was building itself as states build themselves, and Oscar found himself increasingly involved in the conversations about what Redrock's future looked like within that larger framework. He attended territorial meetings in Carson City twice a year. He came back with a tired satisfaction that Mamie recognized as the particular reward of doing work that is larger than yourself. James started school in 1888. He went with Oscar the first morning, holding Oscar's hand with the grip of a child who is not afraid, but is aware that something significant is beginning. And they stopped at the school door and Mamie came out, and James transferred his grip from his father's hand to his mother's, and marched into the schoolhouse where another teacher was waiting because Mamie had recused herself from teaching her own child, which she had explained to James as a rule, and which James had accepted with the solemnity appropriate to rules. Oscar stood at the school door and watched James go in, and Mamie came back to the doorway and looked at him. "He'll be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I know he will." She looked at his face. "You're proud of him." "I am astonished by him," Oscar said with a quiet honesty that was his way. "Every day that he exists, that he is himself, that a person can just appear in your life and be so entirely themselves from the very beginning." She stepped down off the school step and stood beside him. "That is how I feel about you," she said. He looked at her, and she saw in his face what she always saw, which was everything she needed to see, the depth of it, the steadiness, the particular quality of his regard for her that was not worshipful or possessive, but was simply complete. The quality of being truly seen and fully found. "Mamie," he said. "Oscar," she said. He kissed her on the street outside the schoolhouse, which was now something they did in full view of the public, and which nobody in Redrock remarked upon because they had become, in the 6 years since her arrival, the kind of town fixture that the town regarded with the comfortable possessiveness of something they had all together been lucky enough to witness growing. In 1890, the investigation that had been opened into the death of Oscar's former business partner finally closed. The report confirmed that the evidence was insufficient for criminal charges against anyone, which was the expected outcome and which still landed with a weight. The man's name had been Everett Marsh, a coincidence of name only, no relation to Edna, and he had come west in 1877 with energy and ideas and a good mind for numbers, and had died in the dark of a mine shaft in 1879, with things he had been trying to prove still unproven. Oscar went out to the fence alone on the evening he received that news, and Mamie found him there after she had put James and Clara to bed. She did not say anything about the report. She just stood beside him and looked out at the desert and let the night do what it does, which is bear witness without judgment to whatever a person needs to feel. After a while, Oscar said he would have been glad to know the claim is doing well. "I believe that," she said. "He was a good partner," Oscar said. "Before everything, he was a good man." "I know," she said, though she had only known it through Oscar's telling. They stood there in the dark, and she slid her hand into his, and he held it with both of his for a moment, the gesture of a man not only holding a hand but anchoring to something. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For being here," he said. "For always being exactly here." She turned to look at him in the dark. The stars were out in their Nevada abundance, and his face was barely visible in the starlight, and she knew every line of it anyway. "Where else would I be?" she said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with a gravity and sincerity that was entirely him, and she felt the warmth of it in the way she still felt every deliberate thing he did, with the awareness that nothing he did was careless, that everything was chosen, and that she was chosen every day by this careful and serious and deeply warm man. In the spring of 1892, Edna Marsh died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73. She had been unwell through the winter, and the end when it came was gentle, which was the word everyone used, the word that serves for the most honest acknowledgement that some endings are as good as endings can be. Mamie sat with her through the last days, trading off with Pearl, who was inconsolable in the very quiet way of people who feel things profoundly and do not perform them. Oscar made the arrangements with the minister and organized the practical matters and held Mamie on the last evening when everything was done, and the grief was simply what remained. "She was good to me when I arrived," Mamie said. "She told me the truth about what I was walking into, which is all anyone can ask of a person. She was good to everyone who deserved it," Oscar said, "and she was very accurate about who deserved it. She told me 2 weeks after I came that she thought I might stay," Mamie said. "I hadn't decided then." "What did she say?" "She said she could tell by the way I looked at things, that people who are going to leave look at places from the outside, and people who are going to stay look at them from the inside like they're already part of them." She paused. "I said I hadn't decided, and she said, 'Maybe not, but your eyes have.'" Oscar was quiet for a moment. "She was right." "She usually was," Mamie said. "Pearl inherited the boarding house, which was Edna's explicit wish in her will, and ran it with the same cheerful and capable authority, though the meals were somewhat different because Pearl, it turned out, had her own perfectly good approach to cooking that was nothing like Edna's and did not try to be. In 1893, Redrock had a population of nearly 900, which was larger than its boom year peak, and the mining operations were supported now not only by the Calloway claim, but by 3 other productive mines, and the town had acquired the things that stability eventually brings: a proper hotel with indoor plumbing, a newspaper, a doctor who intended to stay, a new church that was bigger than the old one, a telegraph line that connected them to Carson City and through it to the rest of the world. The school had 53 students and 3 teachers. Mamie oversaw it all with the organized intelligence that had characterized everything she had ever done, and the school was known beyond Redrock. Teachers from other Nevada towns had written to ask about its methods, and Mamie had answered each letter with the earnest and thorough generosity of someone who genuinely believes that sharing good information makes the world better. Thomas had become the mine superintendent of the Calloway operation. He was 27 now, with the same sharp attention he had brought to everything since age 14, and he ran the shaft operations with a precision that Oscar trusted entirely. He had also, in the spring of 1893, married a woman named Cecilia, who had come to Redrock as a telegraph operator, and who was as direct and capable as Thomas, and who brought into the Calloway circle the specific delight of a person discovering for the first time that they fit exactly somewhere. James was 10 and studying everything. He had his mother's relentless attention and his father's patience, which was either a gift or a guarantee of some future in which he would accomplish something that required both at full deployment. Clara was 6 and had decided with complete certainty that she was going to be a doctor. This was partly inspired by Dr. Henry Price, who had arrived in Redrock in 1891 and who had treated Clara for a chest cold with such thoroughness that she had subsequently read everything available in his office on the subject and had reported her conclusions to him, which had prompted him to tell her parents that they had an unusual child. "She's not unusual," Mamie had said. "She's just not shy about what she knows." On the evening of their 11th anniversary, February of 1893, Oscar and Mamie had dinner alone at home. The children were at Cecilia and Thomas's, and she made the meal herself, which was not something she did often because the demands of the school were considerable and time was finite, but she had made it tonight because she wanted to. She made the dishes she had made for him in the first year of their marriage when they were learning each other's tastes, and he recognized them and said nothing about it for a long moment, just sat at the table and looked at it with the full and present attention that was his particular gift. After dinner they sat by the fire, because February in Nevada was cold even inside, and she had her book and he had the territorial survey maps he was forever referencing for something or other. And the house was quiet with the deep quiet that belongs to happy places after the children are asleep, and she looked across at him in the firelight and thought, "This is the thing. This is the specific and irreplaceable thing that I came west and found when I was not looking for it. This man in this firelight in this home that we have built from nothing but stubbornness and honesty and the particular willingness to be present for each other every day." "Oscar," she said. He looked up. "I want you to know something." "All right. When I came to Redrock," she said, "I thought I was coming for the school, and I was, but I also think," she paused, choosing the words with the care she had learned from him, "I think some part of me was coming for this, not knowing it existed, not knowing you existed," but she shook her head slightly. "Some people search their whole lives for the place that holds them. I found it in 11 days, and I found it because of you." He set the survey maps down and looked at her across the firelight with the full and unguarded quality she had first seen in pieces, and now saw as simply his face. "You walked into a saloon," he said, "and stood between a man and a gun, and I looked at you and thought, here is a person who is going to make it impossible to watch my life go by from somewhere else." She smiled. "That was your first thought." "My first thought was that you were going to get shot," he said. "My second thought was that you clearly did not care, which was the most extraordinary thing I had seen in years." He paused. "And then I thought, I have to know her. whatever comes of it. I have to know this person. You hid it very well, she said. I hid everything very well, he said. I was well practiced. You were, she agreed, but not so practiced that I couldn't see. He stood from his chair and came to hers, and she set her book aside, and he sat on the edge of the chair beside her, and took her face in his hands the way he had done on the December evening in the kitchen when she had told him about James. He looked at her with everything present in his face, all the years of it, all the grief before her and all the life since, all the mine and the town and the children, and the fence at the edge of the desert, and the margin notes in borrowed books, and the letters from the road and the Christmas stars on the main street, and everything that had followed. Mamie Shepard, he said, using her full name in the way he sometimes did when he was being very serious, and the fact that it was her own name and not his was something she had kept, something he had understood she would keep, because she was who she was before she came to him and he had always respected that. Oscar Calloway, she said. You are the best thing, he said, that this town has ever been lucky enough to keep. She felt the warmth of it in the specific and familiar way. She felt all of his deliberate things deeply, completely, with the full understanding that he did not say anything he did not mean. We kept each other, she said. That's the thing about it. It was never one direction. No, he agreed. It wasn't. He kissed her in the firelight and the house held them, and outside the Nevada night was cold and full of stars, and Redrock breathed around them in the particular way of a living town present, imperfect, growing, real. In the years that followed, more things happened than could be easily summarized, and so were better lived than told. More students came through Mamie's school and carried the quality of what they learned there forward into lives that scattered across the territory and the nation. The mine continued, guided now by Thomas and Oscar in partnership, and produced steadily into the new decade. James grew into a young man who was, as expected, impossible to hurry and impossible to stop once he had decided on a direction. Clara grew into exactly the doctor she had announced at age 6 she intended to become, which took longer than 6-year-old Clara had calculated for, but arrived with the same certainty she had always brought to her intentions. Pearl found her own person eventually. A quiet man named Frederick who had come to Redrock in 1895 to work the telegraph line, and who had a gift for stillness that complemented Pearl's warm and energetic nature in the way that complementary things do when they find each other. Pearl's delight in their marriage was enormous and undisguised, and made everyone around her delighted by proximity. Redrock endured. Not every mining town did. The history of Nevada was littered with places that had boomed and gone silent, main streets that had collapsed into the desert like exhaled breath. But Redrock had built something that was not only silver, a school, a community, a set of stubborn and specific people who had decided collectively that this place was worth the cost of staying. The fence at the edge of town remained. Oscar had repaired it twice over the years, replacing boards as they rotted in the dry weather and resetting the posts when the desert heaved them. He and Mamie still went there, more occasionally as the years passed, because the occasion now had to compete with children and work and the demands of a full life, but they still went there. On a September evening in 1898, 17 years after she had first arrived on the noon stage from Carson City, Mamie stood at the fence and looked out at the desert with Oscar beside her, and she thought, here is where I am. Here is where I have always been going. The sky was doing what the Nevada sky does in September, which is something extraordinary with lavender and gold and the thin edge of coolness that tells you summer is conceding, and the stars were beginning their approach, and the coyotes were starting up their lonesome inventory of the dark. Same sky, she said. Same sky, he agreed. She was right about that, Mamie said. Your wife, it is the biggest thing you've ever seen. He was quiet for a moment and she felt him look at her. She was right about a lot of things, he said. She would have liked you. I would have liked to know her, Mamie said. I think she was remarkable. She was, he said. And then after a moment, So are you, she smiled at the desert. I know, she said with the direct confidence that was her way, and he laughed, the full sound of it carrying out into the Nevada dark, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence at the edge of Redrock as the stars opened overhead in their ancient, indifferent magnificence. The coyotes sang. The mine was quiet. The school was dark and waiting for Monday. The house on the eastern edge of town had a lamp in the window because James was 17 and still reading, which he did every evening with the focused appetite he had inherited from both his parents. And Clara was 15 and had extracted a promise from Dr. Price that she could observe his patient consultations this year. And they were both alive and well and growing into themselves at the rate that time allows, which is the only rate there is. Oscar Calloway looked out at the desert and felt the specific reality of his life around him, felt it the way you feel solid ground when you have been a long time without it, and understood that this was not the life he had imagined at any earlier point, but was better than what he had imagined, was truer and more complete, and was made so by the woman standing beside him who had arrived in his town on a Tuesday 11 days before a man pointed a gun at him and had walked through a saloon door and made it impossible for him to keep watching his own life from somewhere far away. "This place," he said, looking out at the desert, at the sky, at the immense and patient western night. "Do you know what I love about this place?" "Tell me," she said. "It asks something of you," he said. "It doesn't let you be comfortable without earning it. And the things you earn here, they're real, they're genuinely real." She considered this with the seriousness she gave everything worth considering. "Yes," she said, "I think that's right." "I couldn't see it for a long time," he said. "For 2 years I couldn't see it at all. I was here but not present," she supplied. "And then you arrived," he said, "and you were present from the first minute, and you made it impossible not to be." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight and the last of the evening's color he was exactly himself, scarred and steady and serious and warm, the man she had known in pieces and then in full and then in the deep, an accumulated way that years of love makes possible, which is not a lesser knowledge than the earlier excitements but a greater one. "You remind me that this place is worth staying for," he said. And paused, and she heard in the pause what she had heard in the first time he had said those words, 17 years ago, on an evening on the main street of this town. The depth of what it cost him to want something again, and the particular gift of wanting it anyway. "I had not said that in years when you came." "I know," she said. "I remember." "I want to say it again," he said. "Now, after all of it. After James and Clara and the mine and the hearing and Edna and Thomas and all of it, after all of it, Mamie, you still remind me that this place is worth staying for. You more than anything. You more than the silver or the sky or the work." She was quiet for a moment in the way she sometimes was when something arrived at its full size and required proper room. "Oscar Calloway," she said. "Mamie Shepard," he said back. "Take me home," she said. "The stars will still be here tomorrow." He took her hand and they walked back through the edge of town toward the lamp in the window, and Redrock was around them in the quiet, alive way of a place that intends to persist. And the stars came fully out above them as they walked, and the coyotes went on singing to the dark, and the night was enormous and full of the particular grace that belongs to a life that has been fully, completely, stubbornly lived. James looked up when they came in, glancing over the edge of his book with the brief and comprehensive attention he had inherited from both of them. "Good walk," he said. "Good walk," Oscar said. Mamie hung her coat on the hook by the door and crossed to the fire and held her hands toward it. "James, it's late." "One more chapter," he said, which was always what he said. "One more," she agreed, which was always what she said. Oscar came and stood behind her at the fire, and she leaned back against him, and the house held them, the whole house, with its books and its amber curtains and its rocker in the corner and its lamplit windows and its 2 sleeping children and its one reading one and its everything. And everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, and there was nothing left open, nothing unresolved, nothing waiting to be settled. only the good and ordinary and entirely sufficient continuation of a life that two people had built from one chance meeting, and one honest admission, and 17 years of choosing each other. Every day, in the full and present and irreplaceable way that real love requires. Everything, as it had finally and completely become, was exactly right.